is radically different from that of any other creature. Chomsky, even if you're not sure whether you're interested in the subject of linguistics, I mean, everybody should know a little bit about the world's best known intellectual. I mean, he really is the most famous intellectual. He's regarded as the only super intellectual. And a few years ago, some people did some statistics looking at the citation indexes. So if you look at the science citation index, in other words, look at scientific papers and how many times Noam Chomsky is mentioned, is cited in scientific papers, he's like the top of the list. And then the extraordinary thing is, if you go to the social sciences citation index, he's at the top of that list as well. And apparently, he's one of the top 10 ever cited authors. So there's God, who wrote the Bible, there's Freud, there's Marx, there's Hegel, there's Plato, and so on. And all those top 10, they're all dead. I mean, maybe, God's a bit tricky, you're not quite sure whether it's alive or dead, but of all those, he's the only emphatically living author. So, we need to know something about Noam Chomsky. The interesting thing is that there are two Noam Chomskys. He's not one person, but in an important sense, as he will say himself, he's two. There's Noam Chomsky, the great scientist, who founded modern linguistics. He founded the discipline of linguistics. And then there's also the world's most famous political activist, anarcho-syndicalist, critique of American foreign policy in particular, but far and away the most effective opponent of what he regards as, and I think many people would agree with him, the foreign policy crimes of his own government. So very, very well known. He's by far the best known, if you like, anarchist activist. So it's two people. I did an interview not so long ago. An interviewer said, Noam, what happens when Noam Chomsky, the scientist, meets Noam Chomsky, the political activist? What do they have to say to each other? And he said, no, nothing. There's no connection. It just seems that they're not really on speaking terms, that the scientist doesn't talk to the political activist activist doesn't talk to the scientist. And when other interviewers have asked him about this and go into detail, he says, well, there's something maybe strange about my brain, very helpful for me, which is that my brain seems to be bifurcated. It seems like separate buffers in a computer. I can work on my science, I go to a conference with scientists, and then in the evening I can go to the political activism, and the two parts of my brain seem to work autonomously without engaging or interfering with each other. And he said his life, moving between the science and the politics, has been like a little, almost schizophrenic. He's like two different people, doing two different jobs, and they're utterly separate. And you will notice, if you look at Noam's political writings, how little science is in them. He doesn't like invoking science by way of giving authority to his political critique. He will speak as an individual. He will say, I'm like any other citizen, I've got my views on politics. He won't say, this must be true because I have scientific authority for saying what I'm saying. So when he's speaking as an activist, he's merely an individual. When he's speaking in his scientific role, he will be less of an individual. He will talk more about we or recent developments with the backing of a scientific collective. And he's a very different mode of speaking when he's speaking as a scientist and as an activist. And you'll find that just as he seems to kind of decontaminate his activism of all science, equally when we look at his science, it's remarkable how little politics is in the science. It's like it's completely decontaminated. The science is objective, it's kind of quasi-mathematical, and anything social, let alone political, seems to have been removed in order to keep the science and the politics, if you like, separate. I'm going to read from this handout, which I've given you, the fundamental postulates. I would almost call them sacred postulates of Noam Chomsky's linguistics. These are things which he regards as beyond dispute, beyond controversy, beyond argument. They're incontestable facts about language. So, as I said, he's regarded as the genius who founded modern linguistics. He's up there with Einstein and Galileo and Copernicus. What does he say? Here we are. Language is individual, not social. So according to Noam Chomsky, everything I was saying this morning, those of you here this morning, about the social brain, about how our language evolves as a method of communication involving trust, Noam Chomsky says that's complete nonsense. Science has got nothing to do with communication. If there is a function for language, it's computation. Having language means you can compute more efficiently in your head, but silently, privately. Anything externalized, any sounds you make, are peripheral to what language is. You can make sounds, you can talk, you can use language for communication, but he says you can slam the door to make a point, or you can wear your hairstyle in a certain way to communicate. That's not interesting. Language is not designed for communication. It's an individual object in the head. And it's a biological object, and it's a natural object. So, postulate number 2, the job of linguistic science is to study nature, not society or culture. So, for Chomsky, it's very important not to mix up the social sciences, the cultural sciences, the historical sciences, not to mix them up with natural science. For Chomsky, the only real science is natural science, and above all, he means physics. Maybe mathematics, physics, maybe biology up to a point, but physics essentially is real good science. Social science, Chomsky says, is just politics. It's just ideology. People in social science will say what they need to say because they've got a political agenda. It's not proper science, but Einstein's science or Newton's science, physics is genuine science, and he says that linguistics is a science like physics or like chemistry. It's purely natural science. And he argues that there's no such thing as social science. You can study society, but it won't be scientific because it hasn't those characteristics. Postulate number 3. Linguistic variation is superficial. Deep down, people everywhere speak just one language, human. So he says if you're a Martian on the planet Mars, looking through a telescope, looking at this other strange planet called Earth, with all these animals and creatures and insects and flowers and a very strange species called humans, you'd realize that all the apparently different languages that humans speak, Swahili, Russian, English, French, all the different languages, they're dialects. They're variations on a theme. Essentially, deep down, there's only one language. And we should call it human, the word for it, although, as he says, there are different ways of pronouncing human, different ways of externalizing this one language. Next point. He says that children don't need to learn their native tongue. It grows in them as their other organs grow. And he says acquiring language is like undergoing puberty. You don't need to learn to become pubescent. You don't need to learn how to develop your sexual organs. They will happen automatically because there's a biological program to make you from a child into an adult. You don't learn how to do it. And he says the same applies to a child. When it's 1 year old, maybe 2 years old, that little window of the period for language acquisition, the child doesn't learn language. Language grows as part of its biology. And for that reason, we can still treat the study of language as a component of biology. If children had to learn language, then they would have to learn it from others. And they would have to get the language internalized through culture, through tradition, as a result of history. Okay? Well, that would mean linguistics would then be a social science. In order to maintain that linguistics is not a social science, it's a natural science, Chomsky needs to and does insist that you don't learn a language. And he also says that when a child acquires language, it doesn't go through stages. It's not like it goes through the babbling stage and then the one-word stage and then the combinatorial stage of assembling words into something. It happens in an instant. So the child has already got language in its head because it's human, and then in an instant it can speak to itself, of course, because speaking to others is not relevant. But it happens in an instant, all at once. There's no temporal dimension to the acquisition of language. In principle, he says, we can imagine a child having full knowledge of English without ever having spoken or heard a word. And again, that's making the same point in another way. He says you don't need to hear words, you don't need to learn them, you don't need to speak them, you don't need any performance, because genetics has installed the language organ in your head already, and you can have full knowledge of grammar, of English or Polish or any other language, without any experience of using the language or hearing it. Okay, that's another. And by the way, these are postulates which you can't argue with. They're not up for debate. They're fundamental axioms. And once you've accepted the axioms, you can then have an intelligent debate. But until you accept the axioms, according to Chomsky, you're not even in the field. You're like a physicist who doesn't understand that such a thing as gravity, for example. You have to understand these things first, without question, and then we can start to have a rational argument once we agree on these fundamentals. Another fundamental is that lexical concepts, that means the meanings of words, the semantic meanings of words, are installed by genetics. They are part of the human genome. So the word book, not the sound book and how the sound in English book connects with the concept book, but the concept of book, for example, or house, or machine, or steam engine, or light bulb, or whatever. These concepts were installed in the human species at the moment of the origin of Homo sapiens. So long before anyone had a book, so hunter-gatherers, for example, they don't have books, but they know what a book is in their head. The philosopher Hilary Putnam said a few years ago, he said, Noam Chomsky, are you really saying that lexical concepts are all installed in the brain as a result of our genetics? And Noam said, yes, this seems to be the case. There's no other way of explaining how we have these concepts, house, book, and so on. So Hilary Putnam said, all right, well, let's take bureaucrat. Is bureaucrat an innate concept? Noam Chomsky said, yes, it is. It's an innate concept. It's been there all along. It's just before we had bureaucrats, you didn't need to express the concept. You didn't need to find a vocal label, but in the head was, of all hunter-gatherers since Homo sapiens' emergence on the planet, the concept of a bureaucrat has been present. So Hilary Putnam was getting a little bit exasperated and said, all right, well, what about carburettor? You know, a carburettor is a part of a motor car. Yes, said Chomsky, it looks as if carburettor is an innate concept. So even before humans had developed the wheel, let alone motor cars, this component of a motor car as a concept was already installed in the human head. Right. Next point. Language is a biological organ, but it didn't evolve. So he says language is like the heart, like the digestive system, like the visual system, like the circulatory system. It's an organ of the body. But of course, the organs of the body, we know, every biologist knows this, they've evolved over time to arrive at the form that the heart or lungs or other organs of the body have in the human case. But for Chomsky, 2 points are important. One is language is an organ, a biological organ of the body. 2, it did not evolve. It emerged in an instant. While he says that language is an organ of the body, he also says, not really, because he says the body is an incoherent concept. There's no scientific concept of body. And to understand that, you have to understand his understanding of Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, and the history of astronomy. He says that when Isaac Newton understood the force of gravity, it destroyed the concept of body, because before Newton you could think of bodies colliding with each other. Bodies are real things, like billiard balls, they collide mechanically. Gravity, it seemed to Newton, this is Chomsky describing it, like an occult force. How can the moon be affecting the Earth with the tides when they don't touch? So gravity is like an occult force. And Chomsky concludes from that body is not a very coherent concept, but mind is an aspect of reality. So reality has electrical properties, physical properties, and mental properties, and these can be studied scientifically. So the mental aspects of reality have scientific validity. The idea of bodies is confusing, complex, messy, and not a rigorous scientific concept. And so, although he starts out with the idea that language is a biological organ of the body, he says, no, in reality it's a mental organ. It's an organ of mind and not of body. And the final point that he makes is that this organ, the language organ, it's biology, but not biology as we know it. So he says that with the heart, with the respiratory system, with other biological organs, they're never perfect. You know, humans have, you know, we have erect posture, we're bipedal, we have a spine which keeps us aloft, keeps us erect. But we get backache, and we have slip disc, and we have all sorts of problems. So organs are never perfect because they have to balance costs and benefits. They're a kind of compromise. So we don't expect perfection in biology. We do expect perfection in physics. Einstein's E equals mc squared, you know, matter, mass, energy, time. There's a kind of perfection to the way in which these things operate mathematically. But in biology we don't expect perfection. With one exception, according to Chomsky, the language organ is perfect, or close to perfect. It's so close to being perfect that it is as if language was designed, as he puts it, by a divine architect. So it's as if God had intervened to produce language in perfect form without any build-up. Because if you had build-up, if you had a sort of progression, development of language, of course the early stages of language would be not perfect. But he says, no, that doesn't make sense. From the very beginning, from the outset, you've either got no language, nothing at all, and then you have an instantaneous event, he often says a genetic mutation, and that produces full-blown, fully complex language in perfect form. So, those are Chomsky's ideas. I think you'll agree with me that they are exciting ideas. I think you will agree with me that they're surprising ideas. You agree with me? Surprising that language is individual, not social. Surprising that it's perfect. Surprising that it didn't evolve. Surprising that a child acquires it in an instant. I think you agree there's something strange about these ideas. Surprising at any rate. Swabit mentioned that I'm writing a book about all this. And I'm in the middle of this book, and I'm finding it difficult to write the book. I'm trying to get left-wing publishers, people who support Chomsky's politics, interested in my book. And I've been through about 20 publishers. And every one of them says, Chris, it's a very interesting book, very ingenious, but Noam Chomsky is a very good friend of ours. He's always been very nice to us. It would be inappropriate for us to publish your book. So I'm left with my own college, University College London, who say they will publish the book. I mean, it's not certain, but they're going to have to get it reviewed, but I know they're already getting reviews. Luckily, one of the reviewers is Jerome Lewis, my friend. He says it's a very good book. Maybe some of my friends here in Torun will help me to get the book recommended. But I'm a social anthropologist. I'm an anthropologist. I like to connect the biological with the social, but I'm approaching Noam Chomsky. I'm attempting to approach Noam Chomsky as supposing I'm a social anthropologist and I've gone to some tribe and I find a shaman who's very influential, who has trances and visions and comes out with extraordinary mantras and songs. Everyone thinks it's magical. It would be very bad anthropology if I was to come back and write down, this is nonsense. No? To say, as an anthropologist, it's like the basic rule. When you study what happens in another tribe, you don't come back to Western culture and say, nonsense. It's wrong. You have to say, yes, it seems like nonsense, but why does this particular kind of seeming nonsense, why in this moment, in this period, this time within this tribe, why does this shaman have such influence, and why does people accept this supposed nonsense? It can't be just nonsense, because otherwise, how do you explain the huge influence which it has? So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to explain what it is that makes this strange body of theory so influential. And I must stress that in our Evolang conferences, which we've been having for 20 years, I find it very hard to find anyone who will actually defend any one of these particular ideas. I mean, if you talk to anyone in Evolang and say, right, is it possible that there was no language, no language, no language, no language in the course of evolution, and suddenly, in one instant, there was perfect language? People think, difficult one, not perhaps very likely. And the same with, a child knowing English with never having heard any word of English or used it. I mean, all these ideas taken separately, people will say, yeah, well, that's Noam, he's controversial. They admire him for this because he's certainly got courage. He will carry an argument to its logical conclusion, even if everybody thinks, well, how can this be possible? Like carburettor being an innate concept. But what I'm trying to do is, in my book, I'm trying to work out why it is that this body of theory, this body of doctrine, became not just influential, but completely dominant within the discipline of linguistics. I mean, as I say, I've been involved in linguistics, in Evolang in particular, and each of my colleagues and people who come from all kinds of different disciplines, they come to these conferences. It's very hard to find anyone who agrees with these particular postulates, but they will all agree. Noam Chomsky is a genius. Noam Chomsky made the discipline of linguistics modern and scientific. If it wasn't for Noam Chomsky, we wouldn't even be here in Evolang having these debates. So, I hear that, and I have to respect that, even though I'm coming from a different background, and I find when I try to read Noam Chomsky, when I try to read his linguistics, I have to admit, it gives me a headache. I need aspirins in large quantities before very long, because it's extremely complicated. Right, now, my title is Noam Chomsky and the Human Revolution. By the way, I'm going to get to some slides. First of all, I'd like to just introduce the argument verbally, so that when you look at the slides, you're not worried about the colour or the design, you're seeing the kind of argument which I'm trying to make. What I'm saying is that in the book, and I've tried to convey it here, I'm saying, yes, these ideas look crazy. I think they do look completely crazy. But they make more sense when we understand the context and the agenda of the period in which, in the late 1950s to early 60s, all of this came to the fore in America. So I need to just tell you a little bit about the background, and then I think you'll agree it begins to make at least historical sense. You can begin to understand what was actually happening. So what was happening was the end of the Second World War. Alan Turing, as you probably know, during the war, he's this great English mathematician, the inventor, on a theoretical level, of the modern Turing machine or computer. He's developed the theory behind all the world's computers. This work was top secret. Alan Turing had managed, with his team at Bletchley Park in Britain, to crack the German Enigma code. The Germans were using, with their U-boats, they were using this machine to encode their military communications. You had this box here, you tap the keys, and it would scramble with all these disks in a way which was different every day. They'd set the keys in a different way. It was almost impossible task was to decipher these coded messages being sent between the commanders of the submarine fleet and the crew of the actual U-boats. But he managed to do it. So by interpreting the output of the Enigma machine, you could reverse engineer and try to work out the internal architecture of the machine. Well, in the immediate post-war period in the United States, everyone was getting excited by Alan Turing, and especially excited by the actual development in real life of electronic digital computers. And the excitement was enormous, and because these computers seem to be so powerful intellectually and I don't know, almost limitless in their potential, people were thinking, right, what can we do with computers? What might be the applications of these amazing new electronic machines? And one of the key ideas was, okay, maybe we can design a machine which can automatically translate between one language and another. So machine translation was the great craze. Enormous amounts of money were invested in research into machine translation, automatic translation by a computer, from Russian into English, from English into Russia, or from any language into any other language. And the person who first thought of this idea, or the person who managed to make a reality of the research into the idea, was Warren Weaver, who was one of the founders of the RAND Corporation, a very big military industrial think tank, and also associated with the Rockefeller Foundation. And he had the idea of what he called the new tower. Now, that was a reference to the ancient myth from the Bible of the Tower of Babel. I'm sure you know the story of the Tower of Babel. Really briefly, it was King Nimrod. I won't go into all the details of who it was supposed to be, but anyway, they were building this massive tower which was to reach heaven. And the reason they were able to cooperate to build this enormous link to the skies, to actually meet up with God, they were able to do that because they could understand one another. They had language. And as you all know, God got a bit jealous, wasn't too keen on these human beings meeting up with him up in the sky, and he decided, I'm going to teach them a thing or two, I'm going to spoil their plans, I'm going to confuse their tongues. And he confused their tongues, he confounded them, and made all the people trying to build this tower speak different languages. As a result of the fact they have the same language, they lost their common language, they couldn't cooperate, and the tower was only half built, it only half reached the sky. So we lost this universal language. And Warren Weaver, this major information theorist and kind of fixer, kind of scientific bureaucrat who knew how to get money for funding, he said, like, okay, let's reverse the story of the Tower of Babel, let's build a new tower. He called it a new tower. And the new tower would be this machine which would be so effective that in a sense we'd all be back to having one language, because it doesn't matter what language you spoke, the machine could immediately translate it into whatever your local language was. So this was the idea of the new tower, the re-erecting the Tower of Babel, and a vast amount of money went into it. And in the late 50s, this was the most cutting-edge, most exciting idea about how to apply the new computer technology. So Noam Chomsky was being taught, I won't go into why it all happened, but he was being taught by somebody called Zelig Harris, a linguist at Pennsylvania University, whose major interest was machine translation. And Harris's work involved taking texts and artificially rendering the text machine-friendly. So simplify the language, simplify the text to make it accessible to a machine. So the machine might find it hard to understand the sentence, the book was read by John, but if you turn that passive into an active, John read the book, the machine can say, right, okay, John read the book, that's a bit easier. So Harris's job was to work out these transformations, he called them, from, say, passive into active and various other transformations to enable the machine to grasp what was going on, to make the syntax a lot simpler. And Chomsky was taught by Zelig Harris. I would say the entire intellectual milieu within which Chomsky was operating as a young man in his late teens and his early 20s was surrounded by these ideas of making text accessible to a machine, and how would it be possible to make machine language work. Well, to cut a long story short, there were probably two avenues, two trajectories. one of which worked out to be the correct trajectory, because nowadays we do have quite effective, on the internet you can use a sort of Google translator, you can get a reasonable translation, but it works by statistics, it works by probabilities. But Warren Weaver wasn't so interested in that method, the method of large memories and statistics and probabilities. He was interested in another possibility. And this possibility was maybe, just as with all the computers which were being developed, all the computers might have different operating systems, but deep down there's one binary digital code, a deep code beneath the different software developments with like diverse coding formats. Maybe all of the human languages, they have a basic underlying computer code. And if only we could find out what that was, the underlying deep computer code of all the world's languages, instead of translating from Russian to English directly, you could go from Russian to the basic deep down computer code and then back up again from the computer code back up into English. So if you just take, the machine takes all the languages, puts them into this universal language or universal grammar, and then translates back into the local vernacular. That idea was exciting. It was like mathematically elegant and appealing. The statistical method is messy, it might work, but it's not very enlightening, it isn't elegant, it isn't parsimonious. The idea of discovering the deep universal language of all humanity was much more exciting. And simplifying a little bit, that was the idea which Chomsky favoured over and above the statistical idea. So, how do I put this? Chomsky's first work was Morphophonemics of Modern Hebrew. That was his master's thesis. He was interested in how sounds undergo changes within phonemes. So you can have a phoneme, and according to where it's positioned in the rest of the word, before a voice or an unvoiced consonant, for example, the phoneme can change a little bit, so you get what are called allophones. You have variation in the pronunciation of a single phoneme. A phoneme is a meaningful, or rather a meaning, it's not necessarily meaningful, but it can decide the meaning of a word, of a morpheme. But these can vary in terms of the phonetics. The acoustics can change, the phonetics can change, without changing the meaning. And so he was working out how you could undergo these kinds of changes in the sound without changing the meaning. And of course, from a machine translation point of view, if all that's different is the sounds, that's interesting. So if you can move from one set of sounds to another set of sounds without changing the meaning, we call that translation. Now, in fact, what happened was that when Chomsky got his first job in the mid-1950s, he was invited into the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he was part of the machine translation team working with Pentagon funding on this project. And in this case, Chomsky's idea prevailed, which is not statistics, but which is the idea of discovering the underlying universal language, the universal grammar, if you like, beneath all the world's different languages. Right. Chomsky considers think tanks like the RAND Corporation's various think tanks, or think tanks like the one he was working in for the Pentagon, because Chomsky is an anarchist, an anti-war activist, an anti-militarist. He describes these think tanks or institutions or departments. He says they shouldn't be called what they're called. For example, he says, don't call it the Department of Electronics. Call it the Department of Death Studies, because these departments are used for killing people, destroying countries, invading them, conducting espionage in order to exploit and dominate on behalf of American capitalism. So can you see what's happening? Chomsky is an anti-militarist. He was actually the world's most outspoken and effective opponent in America of the Vietnam War, helping to organize demonstrations against the Pentagon, working in a Pentagon-funded laboratory. Right. Now, I think when you grasp the situation, you can see why he felt a bit ambivalent about machine translation. He explained he would accept the job while, on the hand, not accepting it. He would do it and not do it. He would be there in body, he would be there in the office, he would be there in the laboratory, but he didn't want to do anything which would practically, in a practical sense, assist the Pentagon with their military operations. So he was working on machine translation, but not working on it, and he said machine translation is of no intellectual interest. By that he meant this laborious process of working out probabilities was of no interest, but universal grammar, which the machine translation specialists at MIT were interested in, he would try to work it all out. So I want to give you an impression of what's happening, and no one else seems to want to talk about this. I don't quite know why, but it seems to me kind of important. Why is it that we find in Chomsky's politics no science? It's just journalism. It's good journalism, it's morally passionate. I think it's quite accurate, actually. I think he's mostly right when he criticises the foreign policy of his government and country. That's my opinion. It's not a scientific judgment, but I happen to think it's okay, mostly. But there's no science in it. And now we go to his science. And as you find, he does everything possible to remove the politics from the science. Now, how do you remove politics from linguistics? Well, to be absolutely sure of removing all politics, probably the best thing to do is go the whole way and remove all social dimensions from language. If there's nothing even social about language, if it's purely an object in the individual head, you've succeeded. There's no politics in that. But can you see what I'm saying? I'm saying, if you're working as an intellectual, as a linguist, within a laboratory funded by the Pentagon, can you see why your work can't be anarchist? You can't be visibly anarchist, anti-militarist in that capacity. You can be anti-militarist and anarchist outside the laboratory, on the street with your anarchist friends, but when you're in the laboratory working for the Pentagon, all that politics has to go, because otherwise they're not going to pay you your salary. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, I'm also arguing, well, it's the same argument really. I'm saying, because we have this opposite political constituencies. One is the anarchists on the street denouncing the involvement in the Vietnam War and subsequent wars in Iraq and so on, denouncing the Pentagon. The others inside the laboratory working for the Pentagon. Can you see how the two constituencies mustn't really meet? You can't really be in the research laboratory of electronics at MIT, working with all these boffins, scientists. Maybe every now and again a general with his ribbons will turn up and investigate and see whether they want to carry on funding this stuff at all. You can't say, oh, by the way, meet my anarchist friends. It wouldn't work, And also when you're with the anarchists in the evening and you're denouncing the Pentagon and saying these people are criminals, their hands are dripping in blood, they're responsible for genocide in Indonesia, you can't be in this anarchist meeting and say, right, by the way, here's the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, he's a friend of mine. I mean, it wouldn't work. You have to keep the CIA and the Pentagon over here, and you have to keep the anarchists over here, and it's really important that there's no overlap or communication. Well, I've got a simple argument. I hope it's right. It seems to me to make sense as a social anthropologist. If you're asking this fundamental question, why is it that the two Noam Chomskys don't communicate with each other? Why is it when he says, look, Noam Chomsky the scientist never talks to Noam Chomsky the activist. Noam Chomsky the activist never talks to Noam Chomsky the scientist. To me, it's fairly clear it's because the two constituencies are so opposed to each other and so different that you have to keep them separate. And in keeping those two constituencies separate, you keep the two parts of your brain separate at the same time. Finally, I'm going to come to the slides in a minute, don't worry. Let's come to the title, Noam Chomsky and the Human Revolution. Well, on your reading here, the first thing under the list of sacred postulates, or incontestable postulates, we have this quotation here. So Noam Chomsky here he's writing about the human revolution. And those of you here this morning will know a little bit about what I mean by that, but I'm going to explain much more tomorrow, with tomorrow's lecture on human origins. But archaeologists today, they kind of recognize that if you're looking at the evolution of human intelligence, social organization, politics, culture, art, religion, kinship, language. It's not as if you have Australopithecines, two-legged, ape-like creatures with maybe 400 cc's brain size. It's not as if you have, there's evolution, 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 and you have a little bit more art and culture, a little bit more language, a little bit more religion, but it's still a bit ape-like religion and ape-like art. And then gradually the language gets more sophisticated, more grammatical, and the art and culture. It's not like that. You get, in terms of language, art, culture, you get nothing, 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 and then suddenly, relatively suddenly, in the last 500,000 years, especially the last 250,000 years, you get an explosion of evidence for personal ornamentation, art, ritual, culture, and we think language. So there's a sudden burst, a sudden explosion of this creativity in linguistic and artistic terms, which characterizes our species. So this is Chomsky's version of it. Nothing much seems to have changed for hundreds of thousands of years, and then all of a sudden there's a huge explosion. Around 70, 60,000 years ago, maybe as early as 100,000 years ago, you start getting symbolic art, notations reflecting astronomical and meteorological events, complex social structures, just an outburst of creative energy that somehow takes place in an instant of evolutionary time. So it looks as if, given the time involved, there was a sudden great leap forward. So archaeologists call this leap forward a revolution. They call it the human revolution. We now know that it's even older than 100,000 years ago, and it happened in Africa, starting about 500,000 years ago, and began to accelerate. But the emergence of Homo sapiens, what we call anatomically and cognitively modern humans, was a revolutionary event. And the evidence is emphatic, there's no doubt about it. We find evidence, for example, for art. It takes the form of red ochre crayons used for body art, used for cosmetics, but also after a while we get shell ornaments and beads and stuff, clearly showing that something amazing and strange is going on. And as Chomsky says, we also begin to get evidence for, as he puts it, notations reflecting astronomical and meteorological events. We have little notches, little calendar sticks they might be called, indicating actually lunar phases, as if they're marking the phase of the moon, but kind of almost like beginnings of some kind of almost like writing, going back a very long period of time. Right, so there was this revolution. And I think most people today regard it as, in one of its dimensions, a very important dimension, must have been social. It must have been, it's hard to imagine a purely cognitive revolution, a purely technological revolution, which was not social. Do you understand that? It's likely to have been social, especially if language is involved. There must be some social involvement in it. But now we have a problem. Social plus revolution. If you put those two words together, social revolution, what does it do? It sounds like politics?
Extinction.
Social revolution sounds like extinction.
No, put them together.
If you put them together, what happens?
If you put them together, extinction was my idea. Too much revolution and social aspect isn't very good, isn't very good.
You mean it's worrying politically?
Yeah.
Exactly. If you put social and revolution together, it's worrying. People think, that sounds like politics. Yeah? I was saying this morning, when Copernicus worked out that the Earth is not the centre of the universe, that was worrying. People thought, that sounds like politics. Yeah? You know that? The Pope wasn't happy. The Pope was especially not happy when Galileo started saying the Earth is round and it moves. The Pope thought, this is dodgy, okay, politics. Okay? Luckily, Galileo, I think, he kind of agreed, didn't want to get tortured, but as he was moving, he would say, yeah, all right, okay, yes, sir, no, sir, the Pope, but still, it moves. Okay, now, yes, if you put the words social and revolution together, it sounds like politics. So what does Chomsky do? How do you make the human revolution the greatest revolution in all history? You can even argue the only revolution which worked, where the ideals of the revolutionaries were measured up, their practice measured up to their ideals. How do you make that revolution? Because the French Revolution, maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. The Russian Revolution, well, it may have worked for a little bit, but then it went pear-shaped. English Revolution, I don't know, somehow the revolutions, they're an important part of history, maybe it's a movement forward, but the outcome, the eventual outcome of these revolutions, has not been what was hoped for. You agree with this? I think probably. Maybe with Solidarność and the Velvet Revolution, yes, pretty successful. But again, after that comes corruption and factionalism and nationalism and religion and all this stuff. And maybe some of the hopes of these, even that revolution, not measured up. But the human revolution, okay, it happened a long time ago, more than 100,000 years ago, but it worked. I mean, here we are, we've got language. We can talk to each other, we can share our dreams, we can see ourselves as others see us. History started with that revolution. Evidently it worked. It made us a very different species. Language is a revolutionary thing, and that revolution... Now, how do you make that revolution completely empty of political content or significance? How do you make the human revolution scientific but not political, not social? Well, I can tell you how Noam Chomsky dealt with this. Remember, he has to make everything that he's doing scientifically non-political. How do you make the human revolution a completely irrelevant event? Well, why not say this? There was an ape wandering around 100,000 years ago, and it wandered into a cosmic ray shower. And these cosmic rays were producing genetic mutations. And one of these random mutations hit this individual ape and installed in its head suddenly a completely functioning language organ, which had the principles of all the world's grammatical systems, and maybe also the word carburetor inside it, as well as all the other words. Okay, all in one instant. That story is so meaningless that it's kind of not political. I mean, it is kind of science, because it's about a mutation, which is like natural science. But if you insist on divesting the human revolution as well as language of all social content, maybe you're safe. So another consequence is that you have to say that language isn't for communicating. Why can't language be for communicating? Why can't language be about me talking to you or you talking to each other? Why not? Because if it's communication, that's social, isn't it? If it's social, it could be political. It could be egalitarian or non-egalitarian, whatever it is, but social has the potential for being political. To get rid of politics 100%, you need to get rid of social 100%, and you need to box up language in the individual head. And so when this gene occurred, when this cosmic ray shower produces mutation, this amazing thing happens, according to Noam Chomsky. This individual began to speak to itself. It was the only speaking animal in the universe. There was nobody else who could speak. It had to speak to itself, but Chomsky, that's fine, because if you can speak to yourself, you can think, you can plan ahead, you can work out mathematics, you can work out astronomy, you can do all these clever things, and as a result of that, you're going to do better, you're going to be more fit, maybe your children will have some of those clever genes in you that enable you to think so clearly, and eventually maybe lots of people can think clearly, think in clear, crisp, clear concepts. But can you see what I'm saying? I'm saying the institutional requirement, the pressure to get rid of politics means you have to get rid of society from language. You have to decontaminate linguistics of anything social. And so you end up with this situation where Chomsky says language is in the head. It's not exactly in the brain, it's in the mind, which is not quite the same thing as the physical brain. It's perfect. It's got nothing to do with use. It's a form of competence as opposed to what he calls performance. He says performance is irrelevant because it's social and it's just making sounds and it's just pronouncing things differently. The crucial thing is what's in the head before it gets pronounced. And so you have this distinction between competence and performance, language and its uses, characterizing Noam Chomsky's linguistics. And of course, as I said earlier, you have to get rid of the idea of learning, because that would be social, and all the other things which we've talked about in this list of postulates. Now, just to finish, I'm going to have the slideshow in a second. As I said earlier, Chomsky's ideas are surprising, but they are interesting. And they are kind of interesting because they are shocking. And they're memorable. Everyone knows that Chomsky says this thing. It's because it's so different from what everyone else says. And there's something pure about these ideas. I think all of us need to feel that there are some truths which are beyond politics. Politics is messy, it's corrupt, it's agendas, it's money, it's unpleasant. That what we want is something more like astronomy. We want something above it all, more like mathematics. And it seems to me that in that period in the 50s, when science had enormous authority, you were going to get much more institutional backing from Eastman, Kodak, IBM, the Pentagon for a kind of science which was apparently neutral, apparently a form of mathematics, than from anything social, because anything social was likely to be kind of viewed with suspicion. Possibly it's subversive, possibly it comes from Durkheim or even Marx. That would be even more frightening, anything to do with social science in that sense. So as long as you could present the study of language as a purely natural, purely decontaminated, logical pursuit, as pure as mathematics, this would be favoured by the structures of the period. So, I mean, unfortunately, although Chomsky tried this method, that method, and the other method to allow this machine, this language machine, which he was working on to be convincing, to kind of work, nothing he produced actually worked. So he had one whole theory called the standard theory, and then that didn't work, so we had to call it another one called the extended standard theory, and that didn't work. Then he had principles of parameters, and that didn't work. Then he had governed and binding, and that didn't work. And then he scrapped the whole lot of it and started with this thing called a minimalist program, and that doesn't seem to work, although some people think it's kind of neat and exciting. If you ask Chomsky today, right, okay, you have this idea of universal grammar. This is like the common language of humanity, which is part of our biology, and say to Chomsky, okay, what is it? What are the details of universal grammar? He will say, well, your guess is as good as mine. It's anyone's guess. He actually says that. So after 50 years of enormous amount of research, enormous amount of investment, enormous amount of money spent on universal grammar, the outcome is it's anyone's guess. That seems to me kind of tragic. But, that's the story we're left with. And my own view is that we need to work out what really happened. Why is it so important to work out what really happened with the emergence of language? It's because that topic, working out the origins of language, it forces us to put the big picture together. It forces us to link the human sciences with the natural sciences, to include genetics, to include paleontology, to include archaeology, to include the social sciences. In order to understand what we are, what it means to be human, we have to put all those parts of the jigsaw puzzle together. It's an enormous challenge, but it's an exciting one. And although it's difficult to be optimistic these days, things are going pear-shaped all over the place. The planet's looking in a bit of a mess, especially with the threat of global warming, which we don't know when it's going to stop. I have to be an optimist, and I'm forced to be an optimist, because otherwise it's hard to live, to believe that when and if we solve this hardest problem in science, and we work out how this revolution occurred, this revolution which made us human, I think that will itself, like any major scientific discovery, like Galileo discovering the Earth is round, it was just by sticking to his science, it was a revolutionary, including even in political terms, an emancipatory discovery. So my view is you don't need to add politics to science. Already real, autonomous, genuine science, when you put science first, is already the most liberating form of knowledge there is. It's internationalist, it's collectivist, it's accountable. In science you don't have a guru who says something everyone believes. We all, in science, we're always trying to level each other. We're always trying to test each other's theories and prove they don't work, And then if it survives that testing, well, that collective process, then that becomes part of the body of scientific knowledge. So my view is science is intrinsically revolutionary, and if the work to crack this hardest problem of what it means to be human, how we became human, how it was that social change produced our ability to share our dreams and speak language, it wouldn't be the first time that an exciting discovery in science inspired people to change the world. Now, I just want to get to, very briefly, these are pictures, hopefully they'll begin to make a little bit of sense. That's something like the vision of evolution that Noam Chomsky has. It's only a picture, of course, but you just have this evolution, 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 and then suddenly something completely amazing happens. On the left here we have, there's a caribou giving a costly signal. It's a male, it's roaring, it's producing an enormous, costly roar. It actually ends up having roaring so much they can't even eat. They're trying to, obviously, they're trying to scare their rivals and impress their, the females. On the right here we have this. It's called it's a sagittal section. Of course, it's a cross section of the human vocal apparatus. But just moving the lips, closing them, opening them, putting the tongue up, down. On the left here we have those digits. It's almost like tapping on a computer board when we speak. No cost involved. And the point being made here is that in an important sense, Chomsky is right. That is so different from that it's hard to see how you can get evolution. How can you get an evolution from a costly roaring sound, or the thing I was doing this morning with the pantu, to get to that digital system? It does seem difficult to do that by evolution. I won't go into all that. And this is Jakobson, Roman Jakobson, who in the 30s, 40s, 50s was the world's most authoritative linguist. He discovered this system of what we call distinctive features, the basis of what's now called the International Phonetic Alphabet, a kind of universal language of sounds. And Jakobson was important because he came from the Russian Revolution. He was inspired by kind of anarchist, modernist, artistic aspects of the Russian Revolution, not particularly by the Bolsheviks, but by the whole milieu of excitement and optimism, especially in the fight against the First World War. And we have this array of figures here. Obviously Copernicus at the top here, Galileo, Descartes. If in discussion we may want to go through these things, but there's links between all these personalities. And in the middle here is Jakobson, whose main inspiration was this Russian poet, Vladimir Khlebrikov, who practiced with his poetry a kind of word magic from which Jakobson got the idea of distinctive features. And then Jakobson in turn inspired Noam Chomsky with the idea of a biological basis to the digital structure of human language. Alan Turing in the middle here, this is the Enigma code. And this is the thing I was telling you about. This is Warren Weaver, who's had this extraordinary idea, and I'll read it out. This is his version of the possible solution to the problem of machine translation. Think by analogy of individuals living in a series of tall, closed towers, all erected over a common foundation. When they try to communicate with one another, they shout back and forth, each from his own closed tower. But when an individual goes down his tower, he finds himself in a great open basement, common to all the towers. Here he establishes easy and useful communication with the persons who have also descended from their towers. Thus it may be true that the way to translate from Chinese to Arabic, or from Russian to Portuguese, is not to attempt the direct route, shouting from tower to tower. Perhaps the way is to descend from each language down to the common base of human communication, the real but as yet undiscovered universal language, and then re-emerge by whatever particular route is convenient. And this is Chomsky's version of that idea. When he says, we can think of the initial state of the faculty of language as a fixed network connected to a switch box. So he's thinking of actually quite a primitive, early 1950s computer with actual wires and switches. The network is constituted of the principles of language, while the switches are the options to be determined by experience. When the switches are set one way, we have Swahili. When they're set another way, we have Japanese. Each possible human language is identified as a particular setting of the switches, the setting of parameters in technical terminology. If the research program succeeds, we should be able literally to deduce Swahili from one choice of settings, Japanese from another, and so on through the languages that humans can acquire. So he's saying that, like, for me as an English speaker, I'm aware that English is a very complex, like all languages, combination of Anglo-Saxon and various other tribes with the French Norman conquest, and then we had, the Renaissance, and we had the Industrial Revolution. I mean, English is a massive conglomeration of different historical events. Chomsky won't have that. He simply says, no, you just set the switches like this, tuk, 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 up pops English, tuk, 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 slightly different setting, up pops Swahili. It's it would be brilliant if it were possible. And I think because it's such a brilliant idea, if it were possible, it captivates the imagination and has been very important. And this is just a page from one of Chomsky's earliest books, The Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory. In order to make language accessible to a machine, it kind of had to be mathematical. This is so complicated, and this is just one of, I don't know how many hundreds of pages of stuff. I don't think anyone ever understood that. I'm not even sure that Noam Chomsky understood it. But can you understand, if you're incomprehensible, it's kind of impressive. If you can write stuff like that and no one can understand, it gives a kind of special aura. This must be good science. And by the way, Noam Chomsky has never come back to these particular formulations. I don't think they probably don't mean anything, but they're incredibly clever. So this is the Tower of Babel, a particular Russian fresco showing the Tower of Babel. During the Russian Revolution, they thought of building the Tower of Babel. It's called Taplin's Tower. It was going to be 3 times higher than the Eiffel Tower. The bottom bit was going to go around once a year. The next bit goes around once a month. The top bit goes around once a day. It was going to be beaming out messages of proletarian solidarity to all the world proletariat. It was described as a monument to the Third International. It was inspired by Vladimir Klebnikov and this guy, Vladimir Tatlin. And from that period came this concept of maybe through science we can get back to a universal language. And this is Chomsky's, this is called Building Number 20, this is where the Research Laboratory of Electronics was situated. This is a wartime building in which the Americans, partly thanks to the British who shipped some of the ideas over the Atlantic to be safe from a possible Nazi invasion, they developed radar. And this is a building that replaced that building in 1990, I think it was 1998. I think this particular picture here is, this one here is Noam Chomsky on an anti-Vietnam War demonstration. There's a plaque dedicated to the Pentagon. And all I'm saying is that the contradictions involved in all that make us able, I think, to understand what was going on, which is very difficult to understand if you haven't got the background. Where does this stand? Okay. So that's kind of it. In other words, to explain this interesting ideas, which you could say are just nonsense, I think we need to understand why they became so influential, and we need to understand the particular moment in time when they came to the surface. But anyone who's studied religion, anyone who's a student of the anthropology of religion, knows that the ideas at the heart of religion are never obvious. Virgin birth, a little bit difficult to believe. Dying for 3 days and coming alive again, difficult. Because these ideas are kind of surprising, they're kind of inspiring, they're kind of challenging, you don't forget them. You must never, in a religion, you must never question these ideas. My own feeling really is that those particular notions of what language is belong more to religion than to science. But obviously in America you've got plenty of people who are religious anyway, all kinds of fundamentalist Christians. But what about the intellectual community who are secular, who are not religious? Maybe they need religion as well. And if they need religion as well, maybe science is a good candidate, something that looks like science anyway, but that science mustn't be boring, mustn't be too tangible, somehow must be inspiring. And I think Noam Chomsky provided what was needed at the time, something which would please everybody, which would please the military on one level, please the anti-military on another level, because somehow being devoid of politics, being reduced to a kind of mathematics, it could be perceived as acceptable on all sides. And for that reason, it's prevailed. And even today, it's still a very powerful, very dominant force within linguistics. That's it. That was hugely controversial. It's the most controversial talk I've ever given, probably. I wouldn't dare say this at Evac. I'd get into trouble from Maggie Taliban and even Jim Herford. So please, if you've got any questions, you can be quite rude to me. I won't be afraid. Yes.
My name is Wiesław Sławczyk and I'm a staff member of this university
right.
here. Well, I would have just one question. Well, actually, in the course of your lecture, I was just thinking about the times when I heard about Noam Chomsky for the very first time. It was many, many years ago, about 30 years ago. Can you hear me well?
Yes, just about, yeah.
Okay. Okay, and I'm just thinking now, what does this revolution of Noam Chomsky introduced to linguistics boil down to, actually? And apart from this thinking and his contribution to the invention, or just to the describing, or just the considerations about the so-called universal language, I know that people were preoccupied with his generative transformative grammar. This was one of his first ideas. And one of the questions, many questions that were provoked by this was just a question about his contribution to the methodology of learning and teaching foreign languages, natural languages. And as far as I can remember, and I guess that I must have read about it about 30 years ago, he was not very optimistic about it, because he said that this grammar that he spoke about, this transformative generative grammar, was a good tool of description to languages, but not a good tool of describing the processes that occur in human mind or human brain when you learn or teach foreign languages. What do you think about this? Does he have any contribution to the methodology?
Well, I've got one very good word to say for Noam Chomsky, which is that when I was a student and I was trying to learn Russian, I don't know why exactly, it's a long story, I won't go into it all, but we had the rage, the fashion was for these what they call language laboratories. And you'd go into these laboratories with tape recorders, and each student would be stuck in a little cubicle with things on our ears. And you just learn a sentence again and again and again and again and again and again. And the idea was B.F. Skinner, behaviorism, that language is a habit. And if you have the habit drummed into you just by repetition, like a rat being trained to move around in a maze and not get electrocuted, you will learn the language. Well, a very good effect of Noam Chomsky was to demolish that whole idea and to say, no, just go to France, go to wherever it is, go to Poland, go to Russia, whatever, especially if you're a child, just live there for a while, and language will grow in you, and you don't need to teach it. And he's right there. Teaching language is almost impossible. I mean, we have to do it because we might have passed that critical period for language acquisition. We might be 10 years old or 16 years old, might be that old. So you have to get a grammar and you have to try and learn it. But he basically, the idea that you can just learn by, instead of using the language in the community, just by having been trained, having your ears trained with these repetitions, that was demolished. So that was a good effect. But you're right to say that, yes, Chomsky's actual theories are completely irrelevant to actually learning a language. Completely irrelevant. You're much better off getting a grammar book and a phrase book and then living somewhere, because they're descriptive and do not get to the process involved in language acquisition. And of course, partly he excuses himself. He says, look, I don't need to write that because the body, the language or acquisition device, it knows anyway. But you think if he's supposed to be describing the language acquisition device, you'd think maybe he would be able to, specify the mechanics of that acquisition device, but he doesn't even try. And that's what makes me think this is more religion than science, I have to say.
Well, it was good that he pointed to this simple truth that this audiolingual method is like training apes, actually.
That's right, exactly. I mean, the good thing about Chomsky is that he destroyed behaviorism. What came in its place, I think, was an improvement, but why did he have to go to the other extreme? I mean, let me just say, Noam Chomsky opposed behaviorism on every single count. So behaviorism, this is like Pavlov, unpleasant person who kept on cutting up dogs and putting 3 heads on a dog and all sorts of nasty stuff. B.F. Skinner, not too different in the United States. Behaviorism says everything intelligent in a human comes from outside. Chomsky says no, everything intelligent in a human comes from inside. Behaviorism says everything comes from learning. Chomsky says nothing is learned. It's just a point-by-point negation. Well, in science, just reacting against nonsense usually ends up with a mirror image version of nonsense. You know, truth is more complex than just negating somebody else's idiocy. So just simply reversing B.F. Skinner or Pavlov, yes, it was good to reverse it and negate it, but actually language is a lot more rich and interesting than just the negative version of behaviorism. And I think that's what Chomsky did. Just take behaviorism, reverse it, everything comes from inside. No. It's rubbish to say that that carburettor or bureaucrat or email, you know, in the Stone Age, humans had email in their head before they invented email. It's a way of negating behaviorism, but it's still rubbish.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm only saying this to you because probably it's not being recorded. Or maybe it is being recorded.
It might be cut off.
I don't mind. I don't really care so much these days. I think that those ideas are just religious, almost religious nonsense.
I'd like to have a question as well, like that. I'd like to ask about these two entities. We've been all taught in methodology classes about critical period hypothesis.
Yeah.
It is the hypothesis where the human child going beyond the age of 3, I believe, loses all the ability to learn or language when it's not exposed to it. And then we have this universal grammar and this fantastic unit in brain that we don't have to be either exposed or taught language. And what would you say to that, just because I was so delighted by the first lecture this morning, and I'd like to ask you as an anthropologist, what would you say?
Well, the critical period for language acquisition is a biological reality, there's no question about it. A 2-year-old, 3-year-old child would learn language much better than I would, or even you would, because you're way past that. But that's a different question from the idea of universal grammar. My own view, by the way, filling in a bit from this morning, is that, I was saying, if you were here this morning, that the strange thing about the language instinct is that other animals don't seem to have a precursor. So with sex, we can find sex in the animal world. With maternity, we can find the same instinct in our animal relatives. But with language, where's the precursor of the language instinct? And I think there is one. And I think it's play. Animals play. When you get two animals, just watch some dogs at the park fighting, but it's playful.
Yeah.
They're saying one thing and meaning another. They're biting, but it's not for real. The intention of the bite is not aggressive. So when animals are playing, they're being imaginative, in a sense. And of course, all the creativity and imagination which Chomsky rightly ascribes to language, you find in animals, not in their vocal communication, but when they're playing. But the problem is, the playing comes to an end. And what is it which destroys the play? So 2 animals, 2 monkeys, 2 chimpanzees, maybe brothers, maybe playing, they're playing. What happens when they start getting interested in sex? It becomes a real fight. Because in order to play, you have to know how to lose. You have to want to lose to keep the play. So if you watch 2 dogs in the park, the big dog, if he wants a game with a little dog, the big dog's going to happily lose the game, lose the fight, going to run away when it's being chased by the little dog.
So we need to cease to become competitive.
Exactly. Now, with sex in the animal world, you can't afford to lose. You have to win. So the play stops, and the play fighting becomes fighting for real. So my argument is that the language instinct is a version of the play instinct, a special version, but in the human case, we managed to find a way of continuing to play even in adulthood. And we had to make even sex subject to the rules of play, which means, there's a game being played, you're my wife, you're my sister, blah, 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 all these things, I can have sex with you, I mustn't have sex with you, blah, 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 all that stuff. It's like a game. It enables play to continue into adult life. And you could argue that the whole of symbolic culture is kind of, let's pretend. All of religion, it's sacred in the way that a game is.
Yeah.
It's really important to abide by the rules. So kinship, culture, even like money today, kind of a game. It's let's pretend. Still. So we managed to carry on let's pretend, even in adulthood, and as a result of which the features of each game could be transmitted down the generations. Whereas with other animals, they invent the game, they forget the game because of sex, they reinvent the game, they forget it again. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
With humans...
This is actually a game without a bigger effort, because what costs us like to just words, like we have this organs and we can...
Well, when we're speaking creatively, it's kind of play, because nothing's happening. We're saying something, your mind is changing, we're imagining different things, but I can't fry an egg by saying, let this egg be fried. You have to put the egg in the frying pan, put the heating on and so. But I can easily say something, like, you know, I can curse you, bless you, sack you, employ you, whatever. I can do things in the imagination, and hopefully I can get your agreement, and then they become like institutional facts. But in the physical world, with language, nothing's happening. Whereas with monkeys and apes, when they signal vocally, there's an impact, direct impact, physically, biologically, on the other animals. Very different.
That's lovely, thank you.
Yes.
By the way, when speaking about language instinct, what do you think about Steven Pinker's ideas concerning this topic?
That's a very good question. Steven Pinker was taught by Chomsky at MIT, one of his students, one of his most brilliant students. Noam Chomsky is one of the central points of Noam Chomsky was to make language something which couldn't evolve by Darwinian natural selection, to make it so different that Chomsky's definition of language, his definition like digital infinity is one of his definitions. You cannot evolve digital infinity. You cannot be analog and then a little bit more digital and a little bit more digital. You're either digital or you're analog. There's no transitional stages. So Chomsky designed his model of language to be incompatible with Darwinism, as well as incompatible with the social sciences. Whereas Pinker, he wants to connect, like let's have a wedding, a marriage between Noam Chomsky and Charles Darwin. Let's make them connect. It's a good idea, in principle, but he's trying to do the impossible, because Noam Chomsky's version of language, I think Chomsky's right, it can't evolve. So Steven Pinker in his book Language Instinct, he just says, well, it did evolve. He doesn't explain how it could have evolved. He just said, well, look, everything in nature that's an adaptation must have evolved, so language must have evolved. Well, I can accept that, it must have evolved, but please, Stephen, will you give me a theory? He's never come up with a theory. He simply said it must have evolved, because everything evolves. Well, that's, okay, we need to know. I think everybody in Evil Lang knows that that's not a good theory, to say it must have evolved. So, if my theory, and I think other people, we're all somewhere in the same area. My theory that the language instinct comes from the play instinct, the version of the play instinct is like imaginative and creative and all that stuff. The nearest animals have to language is not with their vocalators when they're playing. You can build on that. That can evolve. You can see how a game of Let's Pretend can involve and embrace an entire community and become something we call symbolic culture, within which language would be useful to have. So I kind of like Steven Pinker, but there's no detail. There's lots of detail, interesting stories, anecdotes, descriptions of all kinds of... He's a very good writer, but it's not a theory to explain how language evolved in the species. He doesn't even try. He says, I don't need a story. I just need the principle that it must have evolved. And for most of us, that's insufficient. Yes?
The first question is coming from your previous answer. There are certain studies in technology which shows that in previous times people used to use language in a more magical way.
Magical way?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean that saying was actually also doing something. So it could be said that it was something in between animals and contemporary humans. But it's not the case that we always play words in a sense that it's not really doing. I mean, actually, when you were saying magical things, you're changing the reality in a sense.
Well, I'm a supporter of speech act theory, and according to John Austin, speech act theory, all use of language is magical.
Yeah.
Because every time we speak, we're doing something, and not just... So, for example, you might think that describing the weather. That's not magic. That's just a description. But remember, you wouldn't say, for example, it's raining just out of the blue. There'd be some context. So suppose we're a group of friends. We're preparing a picnic. To go outside and sit somewhere in the field with a picnic, and then I say it's raining. I'm doing something. I've cancelled the picnic. Somebody else may say, oh, but it's only a shower. Okay, they've counteracted my magic with another magic. So when we speak, we're changing the world as collectively construed.
Oh, I like it.
Okay, and that is magic. And okay, we might say we don't believe in witchcraft, maybe nowadays, but I think we do. I think finance capitalism is kind of witchcraft. Somebody makes a decision, some finance minister changing the interest rate or something. It's kind of magic. Everybody's richer, everyone's poorer. Money is imaginary. We believe in it. It's real. Why is money real? Because we all believe in it. You can't eat it. It's kind of useless stuff, but we use it and we believe in it. Therefore, and when people change the values of the currency, I think it's kind of witchcraft. But that's not necessarily negative, because I think witchcraft itself is actually a real thing which people use for their own, and it works for them. It's a way of explaining things, a way of doing things, a way of keeping people in line. I mean, it can have horrible consequences, of course, but in a society where it's important to prevent people from misbehaving, the threat of witchcraft, it can have an effect.
Historical reasons.
Yeah. It's like gossip, everyone's gossiping about me. Okay, you don't want people gossiping about you because you've been having too much sex with the wrong people or whatever. You get witchcraft is like that. It's a version of that kind of social control.
But saying so, would you agree? I'm constructivist myself, but saying so, would you say that science is also like this? Is it so? Yes, the narratives of science is not so much different from
the thing about modern science is, which I think is special, is its internationalism. Mm-hmm. The science, in order for we insist that the procedures for testing a theory, anyone can test a theory. So if you say water is made of 2 volumes of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen, you can be Catholic, Protestant, atheist, right-wing politics, left-wing politics, male, female, black, white.
Kind of common language.
Understanding that it means when you electrolyse water, you will get 2 volumes of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen. So, there's something internationalist and equalising about it, in principle. In real life, science is full of politics and rubbish and all that stuff, but the principle of science is more internationalist and therefore, I think, kind of objective than other forms of knowledge, which is one of the reasons why I think science is so important, very, very important. I would say if there is a pre-Babel language, if there's a language of all humanity, it's the language of science. But it's a kind of ideal. I'm not sure it always works in practice. And also, the science needs to get dancing a bit. It needs to connect with what matters to us. It's stop being about external stuff. It needs to start being about ourselves. And it's a complicated issue, but science is the only genuinely internationalist language I think we have today.
Let me just have a final point about Chomsky, because I liked your description very much. I was always sure something is wrong with his theory and his direction. It just amazed me. Would you agree that we can also say about the way he treats semantics and syntax?
Yeah.
Kind of shows his attitude towards this division between science and politics.
Yeah, the thing is, if you ask about the meaning of sentences, it's hard to think of the meaning as anything other than how it's construed, the meaning in relationship to other people, the world, the inferences people make of your statement. Now, all of that is social. So what he did was, he said, right, semantics is a component of syntax. Let's put semantics into the machine. And let's say that the semantic atoms, like the concepts, like carburetor, or like book, or like bureaucrat, they're in this semantic component of the language machine. Well, why would you want to do that? And as I say, because it's one way of detaching language from the social world and from politics and all that stuff, which is really what's going on, and to make his linguistics have everything it needs, including even the semantics, internal but safe from infection by potential controversy which is political. So he wants to be political in his activism. When he comes into his laboratory, he wants to be non-political, and therefore the language has to be disconnected from meaning. In my view, it has to become meaningless, actually. Absolutely meaningless. I think it's meaningless. And meaning is what drives language. When we talk to each other, we're trying to get across a meaning. And anything will do, including being grammatically correct. If somebody understands what we're saying, that's fine. Okay? And Pinker, by the way, makes that point quite well. Pinker makes the point that it doesn't really matter what your grammar is, as long as people get the meaning. So, if, for example, the words in English sneeze, it's not transitive. You can't sneeze a book. You can't sneeze a. I can hit a book. I can eat a book. I can't sneeze a book. But actually, if you want to, you can use sneeze as a transitive verb. You can say, he sneezed the tissue off the table. Achoo! You know, the tissue flew off. Everyone knows what I meant. I mean, and it's not grammatical, but if you understand what I meant, it is grammatical. What's grammatical is just a matter of does it work? Do people understand it? And grammar evolves that way, thanks to the attempt to convey meaning. To leave that side of things out makes language absolutely mysterious. How did this box of meanings get into syntax? And he has to say, well, it's the genetics. It doesn't work. It's just nonsense.
Thank you very much.
Any more questions? Hope you all enjoyed the show. All right.
Okay. So thank you very much for this interesting lecture and great discussion. And everyone is invited to the last of the series of those 3 lectures tomorrow. But bear this in mind, in the city centre at the Department of Institute, right? At the Institute of Philosophy tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Right. Well, looks like a piece.
Oh yes, we are very close. Thank you very much. I hope you will have a good night.
Yes.
We'll see each other tomorrow.
Yes. Great. Great.
It's a long day for you.
Yeah, it's fun. I enjoy it. Tomorrow will be even more controversial, I think.
Yeah, I mean, actually, philosophers and sociologists, they like controversial stuff.
Yeah, tomorrow will be even more controversial than today. So.
People are used to Chomsky being criticized. Most people agree with you. Everyone has is some kind of evil in the background.
Yeah.
But they are the same way. I mean, everybody thinks Chomsky's a genius. But then again, everybody thinks that there's something wrong.
It's not just something wrong, it's everything wrong. It's really, really, really wrong.
Looks impressive.
Very nice. Never seen that before.
Really? Wow.
It works all right.
So what are we doing now? Do you want to go somewhere or just go our separate ways? Or?
It depends on you. And there is one thing that I need to do before 8 o'clock, but it won't take much time. And, so if you want, I can drive you to the hotel, or I can drive you to the city centre, and then later on I can join you in the city centre if you wish. And then Shannon will be able to join us after.
Okay. Oh, that would be nice. That would be lovely. Yeah.
So depending on your preference.
Yeah. Let me drive you to the city centre, and I'll walk around. And tell me which restaurant you want me to end up in, because I'll go to the place eventually. And by the way, I'll pay for my meal soon because you gave me lots of money. I know you give me lots of zloty, so I'm worried that you'll be.
This is nothing, and we were worried about the fact that we were going to,
Oh, that's lovely. That 600 was great. It's fine. Lovely. Really well done. Nice.
Yeah, because you have to buy the plane ticket.
The ticket was £60 or something in all with all the stuff. I mean, that's covered. So, you want that? Very useful. Maybe I should have let the message on.
The camera.
All right, yeah.
Still working.
Was it working?